Hi, my name's Imogen, I'm 19 years old and I'm currently on a gap year. Rewind 2 years back to when I was only 17 and I went on my first ever solo travel trip. I travelled to Malaysia, Singapore and Australia, and I was away for 2 weeks at the end of my summer holiday. You might be wondering why I decided to travel halfway around the world. My friend Alice from primary school emigrated when we were only about 10 or 11 out to Australia, and her family at the time didn't have any plans to come back. We've been chatting on and off for all the years that she'd been gone. We kind of joked that we might be able to meet up one day, but nothing really seemed to be a reality at that point. And then I was flicking through Skyscanner one day and I noticed there were some really cheap flights to Australia for the end of summer. So I decided to go ahead and book them. Obviously I asked my parents first. Unfortunately, because of the nature of their jobs, they weren't going to be able to come with me, but I wouldn't have expected them to anyway. When I booked the trip, I was super excited. I wasn't nervous at all. I just thought, oh, this is going to be amazing. However, that was about 6 months before I actually left to travel. When it actually came to saying goodbye to my parents, that was quite difficult. It was my brother's GCSE results day, so it had been quite an emotional day anyway. I've flown on my own before to Edinburgh to see some family friends and over to Amsterdam for a day, but nothing on this scale before. So I was quite nervous by this point. I got on the flight, I got chatting, it was fine, but a couple of hours in I started to get really nervous. I became really unwell. We think it's due to nerves, but still to this day we don't actually know why I was so sick on the flight. When I arrived in Singapore, I really wasn't feeling great, so I just got my bag and headed to the metro station. Everything's in English, the whole system is really simple, and I knew I needed to get to Chinatown, which is one of the major stops, so that was quite easy. So I arrived on the street and I just couldn't find my hostel for the life of me. I had to ask this woman who was just stood on the street, and all she did was point up, and I realised that the sign was right above my head, and I'd just been walking backwards and forwards past the hostel steps the whole time. I stayed in a 10-person all-female dorm. That evening I went out for dinner in Little India, in somewhere that the girls I was with had noted in their guidebook. Unfortunately I was still feeling quite rough, so I just had like naan bread and orange juice, but the food the girls had looked amazing. After dinner we headed over to the waterfront where we went and watched the light show, which was really good, and whilst we were there we also stumbled upon a free charity festival that was going on the waterfront, so we were just enjoying that. I think I've got a couple of clips which I'll put in here. On the first day I did the Chinatown tour, and it talked all about the kind of historical elements of Chinatown, and it helped to give me my bearings because my hostel was actually in Chinatown, and so it helped me to understand where all the different metro station exits and entrances were and where the key tourist attractions were around my hostel. Unfortunately I was still quite jet lagged, so I went back to the hostel for a rest and a nap in the afternoon, and then about 5 o'clock I headed out to the Botanical Gardens. If you do one thing in Singapore, this is the one that I would recommend. The Botanical Gardens are free, they're absolutely beautiful. After the gardens I then hopped on a train and went over to Marina Bay Sands. They have a viewing platform at the top. It costs the equivalent of £13 to go up to the top, but I would so recommend this because you get unlimited time to walk around the viewing platform, get all of the pictures you want, and it's just a really nice walk. I went up at night time, so I got some evening views, but I'm sure it's absolutely stunning during the daytime as well. The following day I then did the Little India tour, so this was pretty similar to the Chinatown tour, apart from obviously it's in Little India. Singapore is actually split up into kind of smaller districts like Little India, Chinatown, Kampong Glam, and then there's like the shopping malls, which are like every other shopping centre in the world, but you'll certainly find something for you in Singapore, and it's really nice to be able to jump between the different cultures and see so many different things whilst just in one place. In the afternoon I then went over to the Fountain of Wealth, which is I think in the middle of a shopping centre, so it's a little bit confusing to get to, but it was absolutely beautiful, and apparently if you ran your hand around the ring of the centre 3 times it brought you good luck. I then made friends with a couple of girls, one from the Netherlands and one from the UK, and we decided that despite the fact none of us were particularly interested in art, we were going to go on the art tour of the city. I'd like to point out at this point, all of the tours actually included some element of food, which I absolutely loved, and it also gives you a chance to try a bit of the local cuisine, and on this particular tour I will never forget what we tried. On the bottom of this dish, so this is a dessert in Singapore, there was jelly and kidney beans, and then on the top there was like slushy, and it was topped with custard and sweet corn. I wasn't particularly keen. I mean, it doesn't sound particularly appetizing, but it's said to be a local delicacy in Singapore, so I would recommend giving it a go at least. The best place to eat in Singapore are the hawker centres, so they're like food courts and they're really reasonably priced, and the food is meant to be really authentic and good quality, so I would recommend those. The following day, I did another tour. I did the Kampong Glam, which is a more Middle Eastern inspired area of Singapore. We went inside a mosque, and then in the afternoon, because my friends Manu and Tony hadn't seen the botanical gardens, I took them over there and we had a picnic, which was really nice because then I was heading off to Australia that evening. I had a 5-hour flight to Perth, and I was met at the airport by Alice and her family, which was so lovely to see them after so many years. We were actually staying at Alice's family friends because they were away on holiday and they needed someone to house sit. So we just headed back there. For the first couple of days, I didn't really do much in Australia because Alice still had school and I was still quite jet lagged and tired. The other thing that's really important to say about Australia is that it's quite an expensive place. So I went over to Fremantle Prison on one of the days, which is where they took convicts from the UK over to Australia during the 1800s, and it's now been turned into a tourist attraction. But the train journey just to get there was like £8 there and £8 back, so it ended up costing me about £16 just to travel. At Fremantle Prison, you're able to take part in tours. I decided to do all 3 of the tours that were available, mainly because it was just such a wet, cold and windy day and I wasn't able to do much else in Fremantle. These tours talked about the notorious criminals, the convict era, their attempted escapes and somewhat successful escapes, and also the modern era of the prison because it wasn't actually shut down until the 1990s. I then had a quick look in the Marine Museum in Fremantle before heading back to the suburb that I was staying in. The next day I headed into Perth to see the city. It's quite a small city and there wasn't that much to do, but I went on a tour and it was really nice to see some of the Aboriginal art that's there. My favourite bit of Australia, and actually probably the whole trip, was our weekend camping in Willabinga sand dunes. Alice's dad actually took us out to the dunes and we camped overnight there. We went swimming in the sea, we had a typical Australian barbecue, and it was just so lovely to be able to have that kind of typical Australian experience of going camping in the dunes. And then we also had a go at driving in the dunes, so I think I have a video of me trying to drive in the dunes, somewhat unsuccessfully, which I'll put on screen now.
Hey! I did it! There you go.
Whilst I was with Alice and her family, I went to church because it was actually Father's Day in Australia, and then we had a typical Sunday roast and went to the beach in the afternoon. I was absolutely loving swimming around on the beach, and Alice and her whole family thought I was completely mad because this is Australian winter. But I'd like to point out, Australian winter for us is like a nice day in summer. I then went on another 5-hour flight to Kuala Lumpur the next day. In Kuala Lumpur, I had the same experience of not being able to find the hostel. I don't know what it is with me and trying to locate hostels, but anyway. And all the while I was being catcalled, which definitely wasn't the best start in Kuala Lumpur, but I didn't find that was like all over the city. It was just in the particular area I was staying in. Whilst in Kuala Lumpur, I stayed in the Space Hostel, which is where you stay in these I guess they're like boxes, and you can like lock yourself in. They're really futuristic and I think they're quite famous in Japan, but I have a couple of shots of them. Sorry about the poor lighting, that wasn't great within the capsule. I would totally recommend going there for the experience, but the beds aren't the most comfortable, so if you were staying somewhere long term, I wouldn't recommend staying in a capsule hostel. The following day we headed out to the Batu Caves, which is what Kuala Lumpur is famous for. They'd just been painting the steps on there, so it looked really colourful and really pretty. I took part in the Dark Caves tour whilst I was there, and I would recommend that, particularly if you're interested in wildlife. It's not great for pictures, but it's more of an experience. Also inside the caves you can go all the way up, you can see the monkeys running around. Just be careful if you have any food or if you get too close to the monkeys because they are liable to steal your belongings. That evening we went for a walk around the KLCC park, we saw the Petronas Towers and there was also a light show there, so we watched that evening. The following day we then went up to the Eco Park. This was one of my favourite things in Kuala Lumpur. So the Eco Park is like a series of rope bridges that is right in the middle of the city, although I wouldn't recommend going when it's too hot because you're right in the sun. But it's really cool to be able to run around the rope bridges, take some beautiful pictures, and just to escape the kind of busyness of travelling for a couple of hours. Because the girls I was with at the time hadn't seen Mamma Mia 2 because it had come out when they'd been travelling, we decided that whilst it was quite cheap in Kuala Lumpur to be able to go to the cinema, we would go and see Mamma Mia 2. After the cinema, we just went to the Central Market where I had some henna done, and then that evening it was time for me to head back to the UK. So I had a 13-hour flight back from Kuala Lumpur to Heathrow, and then when I got back, because of the way that I'd planned this trip, because the flights were particularly cheap if I went right at the end of summer, I landed at 5 o'clock in the morning and I went to school at 8:45. So it was a bit of a rush to get back, but it was definitely worth it. In my next video, I'm going to be talking more about tips and tricks that I learnt whilst traveling solo, particularly from this trip. So make sure to hit that like button, subscribe down below if that's stuff that you're interested in seeing.